Hello everyone and welcome to another video of, we talk about my childhood. And today we're going to talk about something that sometimes happens still today, but doesn't happen very often. And that is to be continued. Back in the day, episodes of cartoons would be 30 minutes or 25 minutes or whatever with commercials. And when that happened, sometimes they'd be like, oh, we got to put this into multiple parts. Like, one week you would have part one, and you'd have part two the next week. And if it was multiple parts, you would have part one, part two, part three, part four. I'm going to go into detail about some cartoons that kind of did that for the series, and some series that had multiple seasons that had chapters. G.I. Joe did it a lot. There was a couple episodes where they were like, oh, this episode's going to be continued next week. And then they would. And then they would show the preview for next week. Or you'd be watching a cartoon like on the Disney afternoon, and you'd see the words to be continued. But that didn't happen very often because cartoons like Chip and Dale's Rescue Rangers, Tailspin. Tailspin had two episodes, I remember, having two parts. There was the pilot episode, and actually it was more than two parts. It was four parts. And then there was the one where they get caught by Shere Khan. Then there was an episode where then there was cartoons like X-Men, Spider-Man, which I'm going to talk about in a second. My Little Pony had episodes where, like I said before, took more than 30 minutes to write a script, and that had a script that would take more than 30 minutes. And then it'd be like, oh, you gotta wait till next week to see what happens. Some of the cartoons nowadays kind of do that. Like, Friendship is Magic, for example, has episodes where they're in multiple parts. But then we have cartoons that had a season which was basically spread out in different chapters. Like, for example, Spider-Man, The Amazing Spider-Man, or the animated series, where it would be fleshed out through different chapters. For example, the Neogenic Nightmare was too big of a plot to have it like, oh, we gotta do this part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4, part 5, part 6, part 7, part 8. They decided to call it the Neogenic Nightmare Chapter 1, Chapter 2, Chapter 3, and each chapter was the name of the episode. Like, and like, for example, the parts where he starts mutating into the man spider, there's Mike Morbius, which is where he's fighting Morbius, and he isn't technically becoming the man spider yet, but you can see that he's starting to become it. And then there's Into the Punisher, which is part 2. And towards the end of the episode, he does become Man Spider. And then part 3 is called Duel of the Hunters, because it is basically Kraven the Hunter and the Punisher both go after Man Spider. Kraven's trying to basically heal him, while Punisher is trying to kill him. I think another series that you probably know about, Power Rangers, had multiple episodes, but in the old days, there were different episodes, and it was fleshed out throughout the seasons. Nowadays, there is a season that would have to be split up, and episodes that would be split up into different episodes. Nowadays, they don't say part 1, part 2, part 3. They just say to be continued. And sometimes, like for instance with Magic, they'd have both parts on the same weekend. So you didn't have to wait for the next weekend. At first they did do the whole, oh, you gotta come back next week to see part 2. But then they decided, no, we're not going to do that. And, if there's any other cartoons you guys know of that do this whole to be continued, let me know, because there might be a lot more cartoons I don't know of that do this to be continued thing. I also want to talk about movies. Now, movies normally don't. Some movies aren't done in parts. For example, Jurassic Park has a continuation, but it doesn't say to be continued. But for movies like Back to the Future, part 1, part 2, and part 3, they say to be continued. Whereas The Lord of the Rings, and The Hobbit, one of my personal favorites, doesn't say to be continued. You just see the ending of the movie, and then it fades to black. And you're like, okay, what's going to happen? Where's the next part? And you didn't know that back then. And even Star Wars does this too. It's like, you're like, hey, what's going to happen next? We don't know what's going to happen next. Why did you just say to be continued? Maybe they couldn't. I don't know. But that is my childhood on to be continued, which is a pretty good season. Is still used mostly today, but not much. Anyway, I'll talk to you guys next time. Next time we're going to talk about my top 10 Ed, and Eddie episodes. Like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you guys on the next video.